Welcome to the Higher Ed Demand Gen podcast, helping higher education marketing leaders share knowledge about learning, strategies, and tactics that are relevant today. See what you can learn today by listening to one of our episodes.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Higher Ed Demand Gen podcast, hosted by Concept 3D. My name is Shiro, and today we're going to be covering the topic of using social media to communicate the power of higher ed to the community, nation, and world. And for that, I'm very, very excited to introduce our guest today. She's an award-winning communication strategy and social media assistant vice president, currently serving at Indiana University, but she also has a long history at University of Michigan as well. Welcome to the podcast, Nikki.
Shiro, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Awesome. And I love to ask this question as an icebreaker to all our guests, Nikki. So what do you love about higher ed?
You know, this one is probably one of very few answers that have not changed over the last decade in this industry because it is still my favorite day after day, and it is the breadth of expertise that higher ed offers for you to learn from, to work with, and to share. There is nothing quite like an educational environment when it comes to trying to tell really timely, relevant, impactful stories, because someone in some classroom is studying it somewhere, someone is learning it, and someone is eager to help build out resources that will really add value for everyone and not just those that are within our classrooms.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. And, I'd love to jump into the conversation now and a little bit about your background. From my understanding, you really climbed the social media ladder to start, right? When social media, I don't know, maybe like 15 years ago was really catching on, starting probably with like Facebook and maybe even a little bit of MySpace. That's where a lot of your journey in social media started. And, you've really climbed the ladder and progressed your career starting from that point. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that as well.
Absolutely. It's always a kind of a funny narrative because I, for a long time, have called myself probably the only social media director or person that worked in social that would also tell people that they don't necessarily need social if they can't do it incredibly well. And that's because I've never really looked at it as a singular sort of solution to communications issues. It's always just been one of the many tools within a toolbox. And that's because I fell really into this industry coming out of state government and working within policy development, legislative affairs. Social media just started to emerge on the scene as something that we could leverage to increase government transparency, to reach a broader audience, to talk about resources, and to educate constituents across the state of Michigan about different things that were occurring during the last sort of Great Recession era. So the first actual social media account in state government for Michigan, oddly enough, you mentioned MySpace, which I was never personally on. But our Department of Community Health was, and it was to talk about STD awareness with youth. And that was clear back in like 2007, 2008. So starting with things like that, that's where I found my niche. It was about aligning those resources and those platforms to penetrate really important key messages and to proactively tell our story. As I call it these days, we want to break our own news. We know that social media is such an incredibly powerful tool for information dissemination. And it's also, I think the analogy we hear most is like trying to put toothpaste back in a tube, which we all know is impossible, right? So how can you get out there and be the person encouraging people to brush their teeth first and help to set the foundational dialogue rather than herd cats on the back end?
Love that. And, fast forward 15 years or so, right? And you're in a position at the AVP level now, right? And you come from a social background. Right. Why do you think that, in this leadership type of position now, why social media needs to really have a seat at the table?
That actually truly, that mantra of ensuring social media has a seat at the table, I think is directly attributed to the accomplishments that I've had over the last nearly 2 decades, and what earned me a portfolio worthy of an AVP title. It has been a constant battle of advocacy for these global reaching tools that instantaneously allow us to tell stories and to reach target demographics, to mitigate risk to our businesses and organizations, to identify ambassadors and advocates for our messages, and also to regularly engage and provide customer service, which is so vitally important. And along the way, right, what I've done through social, right, not just on social, but through leveraging, whether it be Snapchat and the University of Michigan being the first, really large scale institution to leverage that channel. And in turn, the first sort of higher education institution to also shut down that channel when we saw that it wasn't really providing any more value to the institution from a resource allocation standpoint, to years down the road, really rehashing and reevaluating how we leveraged Instagram. And then eventually hiring the first sort of its kind vertical video specialist solely dedicated on my team at Michigan to create TikToks and Reels. I could not have done any of that if I didn't have that seat at the proverbial table and report directly to a VP level, and to root all of the content creation strategy in the overarching goals and objectives of the institution. And that's where social really becomes a game changer, right? If you can make all of those alignments, if you can say, yes, we're using this trending audio, but we're doing so to double down on our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and ensure that we're helping prospective students see themselves reflected and have a sense of belonging at our institution. That's a heck of a lot different than creating a potential viral video, which is, sort of where I think a lot of people tend to still view social, and why maybe they struggle in the long run to have a holistic, broader understanding from their leadership and those around them about the power of social media.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I did just talk to Rob Zinkin over at RHB yesterday on a recording, and he's all about strategic planning. His research with his team was based on reviewing and researching other schools and institutions' strategic plans. So we talked a full hour around strategic plans from institutions. And, one thought I had just from your conversation just now is that, institutions could maybe tie some of those plannings or those planning goals to some social media strategy and bring that, a level higher or 2 levels higher from just that, hey, let's create a viral video, to, hey, we're aligning our social media strategy to our institution's strategic plans. So I love that.
Absolutely. Yes. If you're not yet doing that, I would highly recommend that you start now. It really makes all of the pieces fall into place. So many times I feel like we see this not just in higher ed, but with brands in general, particularly as trends have driven so much of the content distribution, the platform algorithms. They want you to use this audio. They want you to design in this style, but you still have to stay in your swim lane, and you have to stay true to your brand, to the tone, to the personality, and to your key audiences. I mean, every presentation we see anywhere about a brand going wrong is because they moved outside of where they should have been because they tried too hard, right? We've seen a lot of that, particularly recently. And so it's important that we have those strategic conversations and utilize those functionalities, if you will, right? If you think of a platform as robust as Instagram, when people were really wrapped up in, at the beginning, primarily of the COVID pandemic in 2020, everyone really felt the need to jump onto TikTok. It was viral. Everything there was growing so quickly. And at Michigan at the time, we actually held off. And it's because we didn't have the resources to create the content that platform requires. I mean, it's so intense. And we took a lot of time, right, to get our sort of ducks in a row, if you will. And you know, a lo- some people could, judge that differently, like, oh no, you should have just gotten in.
Right.
But it's got to be about the quality and not the quantity when it comes to content. And what we had at that point was an incredibly robust and very, very large Instagram audience that had a
Hmm.
platform functionality that was already vertical video and incredibly similar. So it didn't make sense to fracture the brand and to try
Right.
to create content in a space where we weren't adequately resourced. And so we did so instead within an existing environment. And that's one of the things that still to this day I so frequently have conversations with about people that are interested in social media, which sort of
Hmm.
blows my mind that anyone, in today's day and age, when I've been at this for so long, still thinks that they need a Facebook, a Twitter, a LinkedIn, an Instagram. Recently, someone even said, yeah, we need a Pinterest. And I was like, wait a second, what decade is this? Pinterest still has an enormous amount of functionality, but from a brand perspective or a
Hmm.
unit perspective, doesn't always necessarily make sense. And so you've got to sit back and really look at what you're trying to accomplish, what you have to offer, and how you're going to align those two items before you dive into social. Because the thing that's so different about the platforms today that we
Hmm.
weren't dealing with back in 2008 is that they're really saturated from an audience standpoint, right? Like
Right.
the uniqueness about TikTok was that nobody was there and people wanted to jump on. But there's not a bunch of people running to get onto Facebook at this day and age, right? So why
Right.
would we want to necessarily create it if our audience doesn't already exist there and we can't already reach
Hmm.
them? Because the odds even today of like pulling a million new people to a Twitter account are next to none, right?
Very
Like
hard.
they're not really coming in droves the way that they used to.
Got it. Yeah, I love that. I love what you're saying. Um, you articulated it much better than I did, but don't have that silver with shiny toy syndrome, right? And if you are gonna start a channel or try a channel, come with it at a strategy, doubling down on if something's already working. No need to kill that. Like continue that progress. Love to hear it. And
Absolutely.
in our previous conversation, I loved what you said. This has been a constant pain point on also an opportunity with social media. Is like there's a vast difference between a personal user and a business user, right? And so articulating that, I don't know how to articulate it, but how do you go about articulating that?
This one is always kind of challenging to discuss because the ease of use with social media is what, for those of us in the professional space, sort of struggled with a lot because you
Hmm.
can't really, at least with SEO or with a website creation, the tools are hard enough that the average person might not. I mean, today it's a little bit different. You could pop up a WordPress
Right.
pretty easily, but social media, everyone already really kind of had a profile already, or was friends with their family and their colleagues from college or whoever they graduated with.
Hmm.
And so, from a communication standpoint, to them, they feel like it's an easy space to get into on behalf of the brand, and also dabble with connecting with people, which also makes it really hard because there is that personal connection when we need to streamline and consolidate accounts that are underperforming on behalf of a brand to get them taken down, because it feels, again, very much like a community that you have built, regardless of how
Hmm.
impactful it is. And over the years, I've had many challenging conversations with various, professionals and units about the needs and the spaces for official channels that carry
Right.
a branded logo, that have to meet content requirements, that need to meet ADA compliance, that really are looked at and subject to Freedom of Information Act. Like all of these things that are not what you're doing on your personal sort of Instagram or the TikTok videos that you're making on the weekend. Um, to blend those two worlds and to start to establish guidelines and best practices and policies is one of the best ways that I have found in these spaces to create educational resources and tools to walk people through. I mean, still, I think there's more awareness around the work that it takes now that CapCut and things are out there to either create a TikTok video, let alone leverage a trending audio and get it to perform really well in the algorithm. It takes a lot of time. And people, I think, are just shocked by that sometimes. So in opening
Right.
yourself up to dialogues and saying, okay, also you're going to need to create, I think TikTok at one point was saying you should post like 10 times a week or even more frequently. But you also have to take high quality images for your Instagram account. You also have to cultivate a community on Twitter that has multiple, tweets a day. And then also not only a Facebook page, but probably if you want to be successful, a Facebook group. And people's minds just start to go, oh, well, no, we were going to allocate this role to as a portion of some person's job. And, I have to remind them like, yeah, that's probably not going to work. So those types of dialogues can be really valuable, and looking to peers and doing evaluation, just knowing and kind of understanding the broader context of the platforms, not to mention a crisis communication strategy or a moderation and response strategy. I mean, it's one thing to meet target goals for content creation, but then who's going to be looking at it to make sure that if a question comes in, you're responsive, to make sure that if there is a harassing comment, that you're there to tend to it, to make sure that if somebody direct messages you and says, hey, so-and-so in a association with your audience is doing such and such online, and you need to be aware of it, that you know how to mitigate that risk institutionally and elevate it potentially to law enforcement. There's a lot that goes into this that I think still, unfortunately, goes missed.
Love that. And yeah, I love everything that you're saying. It sounds like from what I'm hearing, making that clear distinction of, hey, like this isn't your Instagram that you look at on your phone as a personal user. Like there's a lot more that goes in to a business user, and communicating that properly at, your level or at the manager level, or even maybe as a social media intern, as a student intern, is communicating that and saying, hey, like there's this huge distinction in the amount of work it takes to manage a user versus a business user brand. And so, I think that all those points you made are really valuable. And I think you kind of jumped on this a little bit already as well, but you said that social media often gets looped into one part of someone's role, right? Like maybe it's an eighth or a fourth of someone's role. And this kind of ties back to our first part of the conversation, where there's a misunderstanding of the value add of social media. And I think you did a good job of explaining the value add, but what do you see like in higher ed in terms of people who do manage social media? Like, is there just a unclear expectation of roles or unfair expectation of roles?
For the most part, yes. And it's not unique to social media. And I always acknowledge personally in my career journey the immense privilege that I've had to have that seat at the table, to have the ability to advocate for social media and its value to institutions and to society as a whole. But we lack an enormous amount of digital literacy from a daily societal perspective. And at Michigan, I was able to allocate some of my research and now also serve as faculty there too, to talk about, online accountability and responsibility, which I know is unique. And so for those that haven't even gotten to that point in their career journey, when you work in social media, it's still not even completely understood where social should sit in an organizational structure. I talk to people every day, and sometimes it's in marketing, and sometimes it's in communications, and sometimes in higher ed, it's like within admissions or, alumni, or it's just sort of all over the place. And it can be everywhere and nowhere. And everyone is treating it a little differently. And it's because as an industry, it's really so new still, even though it's 2 decades old. at this point in time. And this is where really rooting it in traditional communications becomes so valuable, right? And this is something I've
Mm,
always told
love
interns
that.
and staff and people that I work with is that, you can't build a portfolio that hinges strictly on social media because it is still so vastly misunderstood and what it can do and what it can't do. And so, what you need to do instead is focus on the campaigns that you're building, the communication strategies you're creating, the graphic design that you're doing, the video concepting and production that you're doing, and those things that make sense still to people because they've been industries for many, many years. And therein lies the other issue with working in social that causes, not just in higher ed, but across the industry, so much strife and burnout is that even if you do acquire a full-time social media role, you're being asked to do the job of anywhere. I think statistically I've seen like 5 to 12 different industries.
Wow.
You know, I cannot undervalue enough the fact that in any given day we're pivoting from writing really specific, inclusive, strategic captions that are short, witty, and engaging, and meet a certain character length. Also, are copy edited, and then creating an animation or illustration to go with those. Maybe it's a graphic. Maybe you're capturing a vertical video style of that too. You're turning it
Hmm.
around in a ridiculously quick time frame. Then you're responsible for optimizing it and analyzing it, reporting back out on it. And in other industries, those are 17 different people that are responsible for
Right.
that task and a team that's coming together. And I'm looking at somebody that's probably underpaid at a specialist level to do every single one of those jobs. And we have to continue to advocate and educate leadership and those around us from an industry perspective about just what we are doing when we make social look so easy, if we're ever going to change the way in which we're perceived, treated, and rewarded for the valuable, incredibly valuable work that we're doing on the front
Hmm.
end, right? Social media is the front door to organizations. Websites, people have to seek out. We are on platforms where people are already following us. They want to be involved. I dream of going to this institution. I love this
I love
brand.
that.
And we
Hmm.
have that connection and those keys. We have keys to a branded kingdom. And that's really not a responsibility you want to give an intern.
Absolutely. I love everything you just said. I think it ties back to the theme of this podcast as a whole, where I cover topics around creating and capturing demand. And websites, I consider more of a capture demand engine, right? You're capturing whatever demand is already out there. And maybe you can create a better fishing net of a website if you have better SEO, right? And so those things help. But there's already a limited amount of demand out there. And so to create that extra demand, like you just mentioned, social has the ability, along with maybe paid advertisement, to go beyond that and make more than what's already out there, right? And so whether that's creating awareness for your institution's brand or creating awareness specifically for programs that your institution offers for students, prospective students, that's how you really expand on your current channels, right? So I love what you just said.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, the uniqueness of higher ed, to go all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, and what I've
Mm-hmm.
loved about this industry so much, particularly public institutions, right? You think about the limited amount of people that have the privilege to attend a premier institution.
Right.
But as a publicly funded institution, or an institution that receives public funding, you have a
Mm-hmm.
duty and a mission to share the expertise that you are comprised of with everyone, right? We all want to increase accessibility. We all want to create a more equitable, accessible educational environment. And social media allows you to do that. I think back to a story from one of my, might have been my first year at Michigan. And one of our schools and colleges, actually our law school, was hosting a guest speaker. And the guest speaker just so happened to be, uh, former Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And, this was around the time that RBG was, first becoming a really big sort of internet sensation. And everyone was looking to her just not only for her opinions that she was making with the court or the opinions that she was writing, but her story of accomplishment and experience is just profound. And I found out that the event was closed to law school students. And so, that's great. That's how lots of events are created. Therefore, you're brought in by a certain person. They're accessible to a certain community.
Right.
And so I asked the question, and I said, hey, I'm kind of new here. I'm going to use the social media director card. Can I attend the event and live tweet? And again, this is like 2014, right? So live tweeting was a different ball of wax then, still wildly popular. People were doing weekly chats all the time and things. And they said, yeah, sure. And that actually gave birth to what we called UMich Chat. And it went on for years at Michigan, where our content manager at the time would attend various talks by prominent people that were being brought in to the university and sharing the key points and dialogue and behind the scenes with everyone within our online communities. And we just felt like that was such a pivotal part of our mission and an opportunity that we could give to allow people who may never attend U of M. They don't even have to be a fan of the given institution that you work at, but you're broadening horizons and you're leveraging those tools to increase understanding and share resources, right? It's not at the end of the day our prerogative to make people think one way or another, but we can provide them access to education so that they can be more informed global citizens. And that is the mission of many institutions for their students. And I think truly it should be for everyone as a whole. And, that's, again, I'd say if there's a second thing that I really love about social, that's probably it.
That's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing. Do you see like live channels still a prevalent force in marketing strategy and communication strategy today? I know this is an example from 9 years ago or so.
Yep, live channels, I think, have really evolved, right? We've seen a lot of people, I feel like, get slightly terrified of what could potentially go awry in a live. But
Right.
we actually used lives as recently as 2020 at the University of Michigan when I was there because everyone was sent home, right, associated with the
Right.
pandemic. And that also meant that prospective students couldn't do their summer sort of walkthrough visits. It also meant that orientations were not being conducted for students that were going to be coming to campus and were already committed. And when you think about out-of-state students, that might have been their only opportunity to come and actually figure out where their room was going to be or learn about campus landmarks and events that were going to be happening. And so what we did with our content at the time was created weekly live Instagrams where our student interns would take sort of turns hosting dialogues, answering questions, and even bringing in resources from campus and asking them questions and saying like, hey, what are 5 things an incoming student should need to know? So there are still spaces in which live makes a lot of sense. But across the board for social media content at this point in time to really penetrate the plethora of content that we consume on a daily basis, it might not need to be live, but it needs to be incredibly timely and relevant. And I think that's where a lot of us focus our efforts. And then we use live kind of as a supplemental.
I love that. Yeah, personal observation here. My podcast used to be like 10 episodes out, and I was posting 2 a week as much as I could, just so I could catch up, so that it didn't feel like the conversation we're recording today is going to be posted, 6 to 8 weeks later. I feel like it just loses some of its steam. So in the context of social
Absolutely.
media, it has to be much faster, right?
Yes.
Love that. Yeah. No. And I actually had a conversation that I posted, I think, yesterday on conversation with Andrew Castle from Middleburg.
Yeah.
And he's a social media strategist there. Super awesome guest.
Hmm.
And he and his team learned that, focusing on the student story, which is a learning and outcome out of the pandemic, he actually found that there's actually continuing that strategy of telling student stories and focusing on the student journey. And that's actually having compounding effects on other audiences like prospective students, alums, community as well, community building, and parents as well. Parents are actually checking in on their students because they won't reply back to them through their social. Like, oh, this is what your college or this is what your school or unit is up to. And so that was a funny observation or interesting observation that came out of that conversation as well. So yeah, it's interesting to hear
It
that,
makes
you're seeing
it makes
similar
a
things.
ton of sense. Yeah. Andrew and I have been connected. The higher ed social world is kind of small for quite
Right.
some time, and he does phenomenal work. Um, but I've always been fascinated by generational studies, which I think is one of the reasons in which I've been able to help content creation stay sort of timely and relevant. Um, we saw with Gen Z very early on this lack of trust in brands and businesses. And I think in acknowledgement of that, we saw a lot of brands start to take positions on issues, right?
Hmm.
And then you started to see the content shift so that rather than a brand or business saying something, you would get these ambassadors, right? What many people didn't know behind the scenes was that not all of it was user generated, some of it was, but then influencer culture swept in and nobody just wanted to give out free UGC anymore. They all wanted to be, compensated. But
Right.
we were able to build narratives where truly the analogy I use is like you probably, Cheryl, get your haircut potentially, like where your friend who had a good haircut told you that this barber, this stylist is phenomenal.
Hmm.
It likely doesn't come from like a billboard that you saw on the highway or even a TV commercial or a social media advertisement, right? Like we
Right.
want that personal touch. We are the era of Yelp reviews and Reddit threads. Like we want to see a community that weighs in and justifies a decision that we will then feel good about. And that's what student generated stories do, right? You find someone that can say what you would say as a business to say it for you. And you empower them to say it in ways that are authentic, which we know Gen Z and Gen A really love. We empower them to offer their own unique creativity or depict a space in which perhaps as a marketing team or comms team, we don't represent, right? To be really good in this space, especially in higher ed where you're surrounded by all these experts we've talked about now a couple of times, you have to acknowledge that you're not an expert in everything. Even in social media most days, it's changing so frequently that you have to
Hmm.
continuously educate yourself and you've got to bring more people in to say, what's your perspective on this? What do you think this, how will this resonate with your target demographic? Are you a part of this community? You know,
Right.
again, like I might not be, but I know it's important that we talk about it. So let's talk to those that are and see if it makes sense, or they want to help us shape that narrative, or they want to participate in that narrative, or they want to tell us, yeah, this isn't the space that you need to be in. And
Hmm.
I'm sure just in saying that, everyone can kind of think of one of those instances where a brand stepped into that space and it didn't go well. And so it goes right back to strategy, right? Like how are we thinking deeply and broadly about the needs of our consumers and industry and not just the needs of our business and organization, because that is not how social media works.
I love that. And as a manager, managing team of content creators, does that mean, allowing a little more flexibility and autonomy for the team, but maybe just as a manager, just pinpointing like certain brand guidelines that you need to meet, right? Or certain accessibility needs, but leaving some flexibility for the actual content itself? Does that help kind of create that culture of creativity and ability to shift and try new things?
Absolutely. I think, one of the things that is so critically important. When you look at an ad campaign, right? If you think of something like Nike or Apple, the way in which it's constructed might be different, but it probably has a similar look and feel. And
Yep.
that's applicable in a lot of different spaces, right? Apple video for many years always had like the stark white background and a talking head, right? Like you knew it was them, but they didn't need to hit you over the face with it. And that's what I've tried to apply as well within the higher ed space. Like, how do you root it within your organization and your brand? How do you ensure that people walk away knowing it was Indiana University or knowing it was the University of Michigan, but nobody had to overtly say it? So maybe it's a small trident or logo. It's a,
Mhm.
crossing of an iconic space, but the dialogue can be anything that you want it to be. The execution can be creative or immersive or emotional, but it's all rooted foundationally in what you represent as a brand, business, or organization. Like that's where things get really interesting and honestly really difficult. Like that's where you need a robust team. That's where you need a really great strategy, or you sort of find yourself lost in the thralls of trying to chase the trends that are within the social media space rather than drive the objectives of your brand itself.
I love that. Yeah. Everything ties back to strategy. And I think that's, if I had to pull away one theme for this whole conversation, it'd be that. Switching gears slightly here, the one last topic I did want to talk about, kind of tying things back to the first part of the conversation, which is having a seat at the table, right? A lot of leadership and executives might ask, well, what's the ROI, right? Return on investment. And so what can you do to really start communicating that value add of social media? And I like that one example you gave of tying social media, because it is a new channel, to more traditional lines of communication. One example is crisis communications or content creation from like a video perspective or a story perspective, right? And I know another thing you've done, this is at your time at University of Michigan as well, but could you share something about how you communicated the value add there?
Absolutely. I always feel like my expression here is that we try to do it 7 ways to Sunday, which I should Google at some point and see what it actually truly means or where or derived from. You can download reports and numbers and social media data has always just been so arbitrary. Like, what do impressions really
Mm-hmm.
mean? What is your reach? And I've seen, and I think this is true to many industries, a lot of manipulated data, a lot of people that will report 3-second views instead of what your YouTube channel actually accomplished. And it's because of that digital literacy piece, right? It's because you can throw large numbers out, but if you can't back them up and really convince people that you're making that difference to drive the proverbial ball forward, you struggle in the end. And you have to know who it is you're reporting out to and what their foundational understanding is, and shape your reporting around that. So we would do monthly reports, weekly reports, visual graphics, infographics, right? Like, what's your year end look like? Previously at Michigan, we would do a year end summary wrap up video, 2 minutes or less of punchy scenes and content we've created throughout the year that says, 4,600 pieces of content were authored. This is how many people were engaged with. During the pandemic, we tracked the over 900 pieces of content and messaging that we created and disseminated just around public health guidelines, including, faculty interviews and interviews with medical experts. You have to categorize it and package it, right, with your audience in mind, the same way you create social media content. As part of my 5-year anniversary in my previous role as director of social media and public engagement at U of M, we actually created a lookbook, if you will, in the way that when you're a prospective student, you're sent a mailer, or used to be, right? A lot of it has gone digital now. and you'd be able to flip through the pages and experience what it was going to be like to be a collegiate institution and learn about their programs. And so we did that, including with print copies, for our year in social review. We had pages that were laid out that looked like each of the social media platforms. We had examples of posts, right? So many times when you talk to somebody that doesn't work in social daily, they don't really necessarily, nor should they probably, understand the volume of just at mentions or concerns or direct messages, things that you're tagged in that might not actually be you, or everything behind the scenes that goes into creating what it is that you publish, and then track. And so we went through this process and made these print materials, and then actually ended up creating a digital online lookbook that many other higher education institutional peers modeled and adopted. And I think that one, we saw profound success, but even coming into the Indiana University environment, one of the things that I've been encouraging them to start to do too is not just report on the numbers, but talk about the reasons why you're creating the content, right? And it should be associated with here's why, because we just launched a 2030 strategic plan to carry the institution forward. And it is rooted in 3 pillars of success that are transformative research, student success, and state impact. And so if you're going to do social media well, let's talk about how on a daily basis, we're talking about transformative research. On a daily basis, we're showcasing student success. And on a daily basis, we are demonstrating and visualizing the partnerships that we have throughout the state of Indiana to really not only educate in-state students, but help attract out-of-state students to come here and stay and work and help our economy thrive. And that's a different sort of thing than just printing out a report out of, Sprout or Meltwater or wherever else and saying,
Right.
Hey, look at how many impressions we got this month.
I love that. And, as a marketer myself, like part of our job is to report, and it's probably one of the hardest part of the jobs because, like you said, a lot of it is anecdotal or hard to understand, right? There's numbers coming in from so many different places, and it's a difficult job. But I think, we still have to continue at it. And I love this lookbook or yearbook example you have from University of Michigan. I'll actually share this out to the audience in the podcast footnotes, as well as the webpage we'll create for this episode. So for those of you who have not got a chance to look at it, you'll have an example of how you can maybe do a look back and report all the successes and all the hard work that your team has done in communications and marketing over the last year. So I'll make sure to add that in. Thanks so much for sharing that with me too, by the way, Nikki. I actually mentioned it to my manager and said, hey, this is like a cool way to portray our data over year.
Oh, that's great to hear.
Love that. I'm wondering where our audience could connect with you. I know you have a lot of speaking engagements outside of just Indiana University, and there's a lot going on in your world. So wondering if you have a good place for people to connect with you.
Sure. I was one of those real early advocates of personal branding. So just about anywhere you can find me at Nikki Sun or Nikki Sunstrum. But certainly also have a website, nikkisunstrum.com, that provides both past and present resources, links to videos and narratives that I've built, even tools and resources, thematic calendars, and some of that branding sort of best practices and guidelines, video examples, reports, and utilize that to do some consulting. So always happy to help or speak or present. It's one of the things that I think is so important when you're embedded in this space, as I mentioned, is to advocate for that value as well as create that value. And so I really take that role very responsibly. Most recently, after I took my role at Indiana, I attended and was moderating and serving as host or co-host at a Reagan conference. And when I had announced my departure and my new position title, the whole room erupted in applause. And I think it's because for many of them within the social media space, we've been on this journey for so long together and frequently feel maybe stuck in trying to go from a content manager to a director of social, let
Mhm.
alone move into a space where, for a while people were like, there's going to be chief social media officers, or, how do I get from being a social media person to a comms exec or a marketing exec?
Right.
And I was able to demonstrate a path. And that is something I want to continue to do for everyone across our industry, is to give back in ways that I can, to mentor or help them further succeed, because the talent that we have, when you think back to my response about how many different jobs a social media person does, um,
Right.
they have a lot to offer. And it's time that as businesses and organizations, we recognize that value and report or reward and retain our employees in ways that will help continue for all of us to be successful personally and professionally.
That was amazing. I'm going to take that whole clip, your exit paragraph there, because that was profound. And
Thank you.
I think a lot of our audience will resonate with that as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nikki. It was an
Thank
awesome
you.
conversation. And thanks for
This is
our
a lot of
listeners for
fun. I
tuning in.
appreciate it.
Yeah, it's so much fun. It's honestly favorite part of my job as a marketer. So love it. Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for our audience for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next episode.